I've been smited so many times.
Tell us when we're live. That's what Jesus said.
It's been 3 days. Am I live?
Yeah, am I live? Welcome everybody to Live Q&A. This is Pastor and the Recovering Heretic, or the Recovering Pastor and the Heretic, depending on how you think about it.
Exactly.
Welcome. I am Pastor Dave, and with me is Dan.
Yes, and if you listen to any of the pre-show chatter, you know I'm the Recovering Heretic.
How you doing, Dan?
I am good.
Good.
I'm good. Lots of queries and questions today.
All right, what do we got today?
We are going to indict society.
Okay, indict away.
Indict away. Okay, so today's topic, based on today's readings, we talk about the Sabbath, going all the way back to the roots in Deuteronomy, up to Jesus getting in trouble with the Pharisees on it. And Jesus gets in trouble for doing a couple of, let's just call them little things.
Yeah.
When you look at the Sabbath today, no matter where you define it, if it's Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, it seems like it is all but dead in American culture. And so I want to talk about that. We'll start at the beginning and work our way up to the current evolution.
Okay.
And so let's start with Deuteronomy itself. Why I would guess that it comes from the fact that on the seventh day God rested, so Saturday. But it's kind of like Star Trek. What does God need with a starship?
Right. What does God need?
What does God need with a day of rest?
Well, that's a good
He's
question,
all powerful.
Right? Yeah. So that tells you something, right? Even God rested, so you should too, right? You are not better than God. Yeah, I mean, so, you know, the creation story, right? That's how it begins in Genesis 1, or ends in Genesis 1, is God completes everything and rests on the seventh day. There's a kind of a chicken and the egg. Did the Genesis reading come first, or did the Deuteronomy Exodus command? You know, because it's also in Exodus. Did that come first, and then they later told the Genesis story around that? You know, but they're both there, right? I like to point out that this command is given to former slaves, right? Like it's a collection of freed slaves in Exodus that first hear this command. It's like newly freed slaves, you know. It's in Deuteronomy, it's the descendants of those slaves, because Deuteronomy is this big long sermon that Moses gives before he dies and before they enter the promised land. You know, he's basically rehashing the entire story of salvation and the law up to that point.
Took him a long time to die. That's a lot of reciting.
It is. He's standing on a mountaintop, like giving this final sermon because he's been told he can't enter the promised land. So he's giving this farewell sermon, and he's rehashing both salvation and, you know, the law. So it's given to former slaves and the descendants of former slaves, right, is who is hearing this. And, you know, slaves don't get to rest, right? You know, the command is to work always, you know, and so the command is grace to its original hearers, right? I command you not to work, right? In your previous lives, that's why God keeps bringing up, I brought you out of slavery in Egypt, right? You know, in your previous lives in slavery, I brought you up. You know, in your previous lives in slavery, you did nothing but work, right? You were at nothing but the mercy of Pharaoh. And I command you not to work one day a week, you know. So, you know, Walter Brueggemann says Sabbath is an act of trust. You know, I trust that God provides enough to not have to work this day. You know, I trust that God provides enough that I don't have to do all the time. You know, it's an act of faith in God's promises, which is why it's important.
And speaking of isn't that one of the things with manna? Like, manna spoiled really quickly. And then didn't they, like on Friday, you could collect twice the manna and it wouldn't spoil,
and
you could eat it on the Sabbath.
So there was just enough, and you didn't have to do that day, you know. And so, yes, that is part of it in the wilderness story. So
what's interesting about Deuteronomy is that it extends to everybody. It's not just followers of the Abrahamic God. It's the resident aliens in your city, your slaves. Everybody.
Right. The donkeys, the cattle, the dog, the cat, the raccoon, it all, all of it.
So how like I had a friend who came out of the Hasidic and Orthodox communities, each side of his family in New York.
Yeah.
And I forgot which side of the family, but one of his grandparents would hire Gentiles to turn lights on and off on the Sabbath, turn the thermostat up or down. Basically come in and do all those basic things.
Yeah, because it's work.
To continue comfort. Given what Deuteronomy says, how was that not violating the Sabbath? Because you're supposed to give everybody time off. So if you're hiring someone else to do it, then they're not honoring the Sabbath.
Yeah. I don't know the exact...
So I'm a heretic. I ask these questions.
I don't know the exact nature of Jewish jurisprudence, right? It's evolved over 2,000 years, thousands and thousands of years, right? More than that, 3,000 years, so they have a perfectly legitimate, justification of that. I just don't know it because I'm not a Jewish jurist,
Okay.
So...
we'll leave that one on the table until we actually get very interdenominational.
Right. If you get a rabbi on here, you can ask them how they puzzle that out.
We need to start doing that.
Yeah, in general, I would say our Jewish brothers and, we can make the mistake of looking at that stuff and thinking it's legalism, and our Jewish brothers and sisters tend to think of it as it is training you to further trust in the promises God has made to God's people, right? And so in that regard, a Gentile working doesn't really
interfere with that,
right? It's and it doesn't interfere with what a Gentile needs to be righteous, which is a different, whole category for Jewish people, So in general, that's about all I can say, is that they tend to think of all of that they do to follow the laws. They see it as training you to trust in God's promises, more fully. And in their defense, it's worked. They survived pogroms and holocausts and, deportations the world over, and yet here they are, so in a certain sense it has, I would give them credit. It has achieved it.
Yeah.
So.
Well, on that very note, how is work itself actually defined in Deuteronomy or elsewhere in the Bible?
No. Other than it kind of goes into like the male and female slave, and it goes into, on the law of Jubilee stuff, it goes into planting crops and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But no, which is why there's a whole tradition of Jewish jurisprudence and legal thought for 3,000 years, around this very subject.
Yeah. So look at the Talmud. There be
look at the Talmud.
Extensive writing.
Right. They have an extensive definition of what counts for work and what doesn't, and when you're allowed to make exceptions and when you're not.
Yeah, because it just occurred to me that a lot of what I do to relax, when the rare times I do relax, a lot of what I do for that, I think would be counted as work.
Probably.
In that, which means I wouldn't be able to relax on the Sabbath.
Yeah. Well, we sometimes forget that it's not just about relaxing, right? Like, the relaxing part is an important piece, but it's also about worshiping, right? You are to rest so that you may worship. And so it's not just like you need a sabbatical.
Yeah.
It's it's rest unto a very specific purpose.
Yeah.
And we should remember that too, right? It's not, because if it were just rest, it wouldn't be all that different than like any other self-help book, right?
Yeah.
What separates it from self-help is what it separates it from how to be a productive individual. You'll find they'll say in those books all the time, you need a weekend, and what separates it from productivity help is God's command that you are to rest so that
Yeah.
This day a week you may be wholly devoted to worshiping me.
But then that gets into the whole, like the Benedictine method, that manual labor, that physical, is a form of worship.
Yeah, Christians have a different tradition around this, right? So we have a different, and even they would say they don't work on Sundays, right?
Yeah.
So.
But that's like one of them, for me, like gardening. That really helps me. And it is to me a form of worship.
Yeah, he doesn't say, you should hear it carefully, right? Because he doesn't say you can't work the other 6 days of the week.
Yeah.
Work's not the problem. And in fact, God wants us to work, in a certain, right? Go forth and tame the earth, right? And fill and subdue the earth. And, God wants us to work and be creative and all that stuff. But even when we're at like the garden, for example, I think what God's trying to get at is life is not actually about productivity, or entirely about productivity, and we can get so caught up in, even the garden exists to be unto productivity in some cases, right? You're hoping to get something from it. You're hoping to get produce. You're hoping, and so God's kind of always in this constant quest that God does not ordain life to exist just to be productive. Yeah. And so we get this one day a week where it's like, maybe you don't have to engage all of life as a productivity exercise,
Yeah. That's interesting just in that it contrasts a little bit with, like for me, the garden, I enjoy the fruits of it. I like the end product.
Yeah.
But it's the process. It's just like when I drive. The destination isn't what I care about. I enjoy the process.
Yeah, and this is right. And, and I think that's all legitimate, which is why, among many reasons, Christians have been less focused on this aspect of it, but we should maybe think about, even if we enjoy the process, how the process is still a process unto productivity, and like this church is a church of doers, right? Always wants to do something, right? And perhaps the lesson for us is, God's always kind of commanding, sit and wait, my day draws near, and perhaps, we don't need to do unto productivity all the time, Most of the time is fine.
I don't know. I'm kind of thinking of completing that sentence. We don't have to do unto productivity as productivity does unto us.
Well, right. God's going to accomplish it, right? Which is part of the reason we can sit and wait.
Yeah.
Well,
and that brings us up to Jesus and him getting in trouble for working on the Sabbath. That, from what you described, you can take action that involves worship, which I assume is why you could have a priest at the temple or a rabbi on the Sabbath, because that's their work.
Yeah.
But it is for the sake of worship. And you now.
Right. I work on, Yeah. I work on the Sabbath.
You and I both. The media team puts in a lot of work every Sunday.
We all work on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Yeah, it should be noted, right? We can do this thing where we can be like, oh, those legalistic Pharisees, which we should be a little careful about, because the objection here isn't that Jesus couldn't heal in an emergency, right? All Jewish law forever has always stated, it is fine to save life on the Sabbath if that involves work. Like life is more important. So that's not really the debate. The debate is, like, this guy had a withered hand, and he'd clearly been dealing with it for a while. So the debate is, couldn't have this had waited till Monday? Is always the argument Jesus is getting in. Like, it's not the issue of saving life that's the issue. It's the issue that, did this person need to be healed right now, or could it have waited till office hours? And And that's always the debate Jesus is kind of, he's being deliberately rude here, right? He's just poking people in the eye with a stick, right? Kind of all week long, like, and so that's...
So you're saying he's a little ornery.
Oh, yeah, he's,
Yeah.
right,
Okay.
right.
So it's a good trait. It's kind of like worshiping to be ornery.
Well, let's be careful with that one.
I'm trying to make a spousal point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so just so relaying, Steve has some comments about doing a lot of work and getting things accomplished.
And then Renee had a question. Trust in God seems a huge challenge for all of us. Is focus on a law a way to try to control our fear of relying on that trust?
Okay, so trusting God as an issue.
Well, okay, so to Renee's question, I'm a Lutheran, so the law never fully brings about... As a good Lutheran, I would say the command to do or not to do something, a law never brings about fully God's trust, right? That's half of it, but we need gospel also, we need promise, and so it's not just, I guess in the Sabbath's case, it's not just the command don't work, that brings about trust in God, but it's the flip side, which is that God already provides, that's the promise, right? Command is do not work. The promise is I already brought you out of slavery and have provided everything you've needed. I am your God. I got you this far. I will get you the one more day without you going to the grocery store.
Yeah.
Or I'll get you the one more day without collecting extra manna in the wilderness.
Well, let's jack up trust to the next level. In that, ultimately, for Christians and Phariseans, Pharisee Jews, resurrection is the big thing you're trusting in.
Yeah.
For Sadduceans, there is no resurrection. That's it.
Yeah.
Done.
Yeah.
Where is, under that old Sadducean view, if this life is all there is, what's the big trust issue then? What dies in? I can see for Phariseans and Christians.
It's that God provides for the people now and continuously into the future. So this is why it's always such a big deal in the Old Testament that people have kids, right? Abraham, it starts with Abraham, but why it's always such a huge deal, right?
Barrenness is such a
big barrenness thing, is a threat literally to the promise itself, right? Because if there's no line to pass it on to, the promise is dead. And so it's about passing it on through your descendants and the generations, and
Well, and maybe this is where we start getting into discussion of what's happening today. There have been a lot of sociological studies as to why something that is as established as climate change, as just one example. We have several existential threats that humanity's facing right now. Climate change is one of them, very clear.
Yeah.
But for some reason in the US, we have this preponderance of climate change deniers, and it's politicized. Whereas most other places, it's purely science. Part of that politicization...
I would say, to give us a little bit of credit, or everybody else a little bit of not credit, right? It's clearly science, but Germany reopened all its coal plants.
Yeah.
And
ironically, it's right after they did a test to see if they could run on pure green energy, and they could.
And they still reopened.
And they still went,
right,
yeah.
So even though it's pure science, right, like the execution is hard for all
Yeah,
of us,
well, there's
right?
still lots of money involved here.
Right.
But in the sociological studies, they found that the reason underlying a lot of that denial is there's a lack of care. Basically, it's generational narcissism in that
I'm not going to
people don't care. It's like, I still want to drive my 1 mile a gallon pickup, and it doesn't matter if my grandkids are going to literally be living in a living hell.
Right.
There's just not that care of looking forward to future generations. It's about me, me, me.
Right.
Did that not exist back then? Or was it that the entire culture was different? The entire culture was very generational, group-oriented.
I mean, people are people the world over, right? And people haven't changed, right? Since there's a school of history called the Annales School, or the French School, which says that there's only been one change in all of human history, and the rest is literally all the same, and that one change is shifting from hunter-gatherers to settled agriculture, you know.
And that's it.
And that's it. That's the only change that's ever happened in all history, you know. And everything else is the same tune. And so it's a little bit absurd, but there's a point there in that people are still the same, right? So I don't want to make the ancient world out to be saints, you know. They depleted their environments just like we do, you know. I would say it's a different focus because, yes, you have I don't think we think about lineage, you know, like as Americans. It's just not, you know, because you got to remember, like for them, like in ancient Israel especially, like each parcel of land was given to a specific family, right? You know, like literally God's promise was very tangible. This 4-acre plot is ours, you know, given to us by God. It's why you couldn't sell or buy the land technically, like in ancient Israel, is that it wasn't actually yours to sell or buy. You couldn't give it away because God gave it to you permanently.
Wow. Okay.
You know, and so because of that, like, you know, it's very focused on I've got to have a next generation to pass this down to, you know.
Yeah.
And we've got to be concerned with that, you know. So it's just a different mindset than we have where.
Yeah, here it's just a commodity, buy, sell, trade.
Right, I can buy land whenever I want, right? I can buy more stuff. I don't think about a lineage to, you know, my progeny to pass on down my nobility, you know.
It's fascinating that something as simple as that can affect such a swath of a cultural mindset.
Yeah, I mean, the radical version of the Annales School, that French school, is that there's been two changes in history.
This is the radical version.
Right, this is the radical. There's been two changes, and that's the change from hunter-gatherer to settled agriculture, and the change from pre-industrial to post-industrial societies. You know, that the Industrial Revolution is a second change because it commoditizes all these things that weren't really commodities before, you know.
And this brings us now to
we've wandered
almost
into
contemporary.
The Annales School, so I don't know what to tell you, but you know, but there it is. Like,
you know, we've got this big Deuteronomy thing, and yet it's relatively recent that we've actually had a weekend.
Yeah.
It was a big win for workers to just get Sunday mornings off to go to church.
Yeah.
So where did we lose our way? And is that why it's so easy for us today to ignore the Sabbath?
I mean, Israel was not very good at this, right? I mean, the prophets are already complaining about it in the Old Testament. You can go back to the Old Testament. They're already complaining about how they don't keep the Sabbath.
It's like two generations later, it's already...
Right. I mean, they are just not very good at it. You know, nobody's been very good at it. And that's a sin problem. It's just a problem of we don't actually trust, you know, that there's enough to last and for us not to work. You know, it gets back to that. Luther says all sin begins with a failure to trust in God's good promises, you know, and so like we don't trust in God's good promise that there is enough for us not to work, you know. I'm the same way, right? You know, I'll answer that phone call on Friday, you know, we are, you know, it's not just us, and it's not like anybody's ever figured this out, right? Archaeologists would tell you, and this is true, right, that there's no evidence Israel actually followed any of these rules.
Wow.
You know, besides the not eating pigs part. You know, like that's the only archaeological evidence that they didn't eat pork, you know. And so there's no archaeological evidence that these things were really followed. Now, that's not surprising because the prophets are already there railing against how they're not following any of these rules, right? See Jeremiah, prophet, but like we've never done it because it's this call which runs so counter to what we really believe,
So this is putting it in an extreme, but our premise today of why have we killed the Sabbath is kind of moot because we never really let it live.
We never really let it live, right? It is a command in classic Lutheran fashion, right? Law should convict you that you are a sinner, and so you should walk away from thou shalt rest on the Sabbath day and keep it holy and think, I really don't. Again, I've said this about the commandments before, but if you walk away from the commandments thinking, yep, got that one, you have totally missed the point. And we should walk away from it hearing, ugh, I haven't done it. And then the grace is in our gospel lesson where Jesus comes in and says, I heal you anyway. And that's the good news, right? Is that God's grace is not dependent on our Sabbath keeping. Thanks be to God. Right.
So, just to wrap it up and tidy it up with a nice bow, I like the fact that ultimately it is moot that we never really let the Sabbath live.
We never really let it live anyway. It was stillborn on arrival. So
why are we exacerbating it today? And I say that in what little bit of honoring the Sabbath we've done in traditional American culture is you go to temple on Saturday or you go to Christian church on Sunday,
right?
And that's you go in the morning and that's it, and then you did other stuff.
Yeah.
Today,
we don't even
church attendance is dwindling, and so we're not even doing that little bit of honoring the Sabbath in the morning. Now it's get up, cut the lawn, do the chores you didn't get to on Saturday, get the kids to football practice, Little League, whatever. All the big kids' activities now are on Sundays. Get ready for my big presentation Monday morning. Sometimes actually go into the office. The only thing that you're honoring about the Sabbath is that you go into the office in a t-shirt and jeans instead of a suit.
Right. Casual
Sabbath.
Right.
But we're not, in America, more and more and more, we're not even giving that little bit of recognition.
Yeah.
What has been changing over the last decade or two that's caused that?
That's a big question.
I want answers.
Yeah. I had a friend who's an Episcopalian priest, and he used to describe why his family is Episcopalian. And he said when his great-great-great-grandfather immigrated to this country, he was an agnostic Jew. But in order to get tenure at UNC, he was a professor, in order to get tenure at UNC, he had to show membership at a church, so he became Episcopalian.
Oh, wow.
And
so member of a synagogue wasn't enough.
No, had to show membership at a church to get tenure.
Wow.
Now that's an extreme case, but we used to live in this world that's one of my favorite theologians calls Christendom. It's not just Christianity, but it's Christianity enforced by societal pressure and often legal threat. So blue laws are the example of that, right, in this country, right? My grandmother, to her dying day, remembered the exact day, April 4th, 1961, when movies were shown on Sundays.
Wow.
It was like the world had ended, for her, right? Like, that's how shocking it was.
So it was like, prior to that, it was enforced Christianity.
Well, I mean, I don't know if it was enforced, because I don't want to go that far. But there was a strong cultural pressure, and Christian norms were cultural norms. Those two were kind of synonymous. That is just not true anymore. Christian norms are not cultural norms, and we see that in all sorts of good and bad ways, But the effect of that is that you now have to make what is a hard decision? You have to make a hard decision between sports, we'll use sports as the example, sports, and all that sports represent, right? It's not just, if it were just sports, we could win that battle, but it's sports that lead to, positive things in school, which leads to, good scholarships, which leads to, a good college, which then leads to the good life, and so you have to make a choice between a very hard choice, and I'm very sympathetic to people about it, that between the hard choice of what is defined as the path to the good life and worship. It's a hard choice. And just frankly, since society is not enforcing or culturally pressuring that choice anymore, and since those two have diverged, a lot of people aren't going to make that choice anymore. They just aren't,
Yeah.
And then I don't think it's just that. I think we in the church have done a particularly piss poor job of keeping the Sabbath day holy ourselves. And that's everything from clerical sex abuse scandals to bad preaching. Luther spends as much time in the large catechism when he's talking about keeping the Sabbath day as talking about how bad the Catholic priests are at preaching, as he does explaining what it means to listen to God's word, when he's explaining this commandment, right? And we've just, I don't want to let us off the hook as church. We've done a piss poor job ourselves. We've fought, we've had sex abuse and other financial scandals. We've been bad at preaching. Yeah,
and just this week, the Washington Post had another big expose about how all the incredible abuses that were going on at Indian boarding schools.
Right, in Indian boarding schools, right? The boarding schools. And all of that is a failure to keep the Sabbath day holy, and that's, and it's no wonder then that people look all that and went, yeah.
It's been tarnished, yeah.
Right, we are not hard enough on ourselves, we messed up. There's no other way to put it. So, thankfully God forgives screw-ups, or else we wouldn't be here, So.
And here endeth the lesson.
Right, and here endeth the lesson.
Yeah, because we actually are past time, which is great.
Yes.
But I think that is a good wrap point. So, cool, thank you.
All right,
and thanks, Steve and Renee, for comments and questions.
Yep.
And I guess we're back next week.
We are.
All right, for Father's Day.
All right.
So if you have paternal questions, get them ready.
Yeah.
We'll see you next week.
See you next week.